So originally when I conceived this paper, it was going to be like a comparison between the New England Great Awakening and the black metal moment in the early 90s in Norway, but the more I researched, the more I discovered that there's a huge wealth of information just about black metal as a religious awakening without even really needing to prove it through comparing it to the Great Awakening. So most of what I've done with this is more about just what actually happened, but there still is a huge amount of information left to find. There's a popular video on YouTube called Black Metal Babysitting. In it, we see a heavily stylized extreme metal fan who is struggling with how to entertain a child in his care. Eventually, we see him grab some popsicle sticks and glue, and soon the pair have constructed a small wooden church. Extreme metal's reputation precedes it, and the high view count on the video, which is nearing 6 million, suggests that it's no real surprise when the duo sets the structure ablaze. Church burning in the name of Satan has become a central part of mainstream metal lore, but the truth is that this sort of material dedication to one's art has only occurred once in metal's 50-year history, ending as abruptly as it began. Far from disappointing, though, this fact makes the spontaneous and singular nature of the rash of arsons, grave desecrations, and murders that swept across Norway in the early 90s all the more fascinating. A possible explanation for this kind of fevered outburst is that, unlike the more common motivations for making rock music, parties, fame, sex, emotional expression, the black metal artists of Scandinavia used their music to access a higher power, for many with the goal of creating some kind of actual magic. Inspired by the discussion of the Great Awakening in New England and early religious revivals in America in Gilbert Seldy's The Stammering Century, I believe that these events constitute a religious and spiritual awakening in the extreme metal community. To that end, I've been using the historical context in which black metal was born, the personal beliefs of its central figures, and the legacy they left for future performers to situate black metal within the history of collective religious mania, rather than just as an outlier violent accident in the history of rock music. Black metal is a form of extreme heavy metal characterized by atmosphere-focused instrumentals, shrieking inhuman vocals, and lo-fi recording quality. The genre has its roots in the pushback by more extreme death and thrash metal bands against the mainstream success found by some of the tamer artists of the era, like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. The history of black metal is usually split into two waves. And the first wave occurred in the 1980s with the formation of bands like Bathory, Merciful Fate, and Venom, whose second album coined the term black metal. While most bands from this period did not sound musically very similar to what would become known as black metal, their lyrical focus on Satan and the occult had a direct influence on bands to follow. Also of importance during this period was the introduction of corpse paint. Frontman King Diamond of the Danish group Merciful Fate, alongside Sarcophago, Celtic Frost, and several other bands of the era, frequently made up their faces in black and white paint in an effort to look more demonic or corpse-like. This practice would become a central feature in the stage presentations for a lot of later bands. But for all that these bands may have sung about being in league with Satan, as Venom did in 1981's Welcome to Hell, the performers themselves never actually identified as Satanists. And of course, a surface alignment with the occult or the use of satanic imagery is relatively commonplace in American and English rock music, so it's easy for us to understand how a band like Venom can talk the satanic talk without sacrificing goats. But all that changed when black metal arrived in Norway. In the summer of 1991, Øystein Artseth, the guitarist of the founding second wave band Mayhem, known primarily by his stage name Euronymous, opened an independent record store in Oslo, Norway. The store was called Helvete, Norwegian for hell, and its dark and musty demeanor, along with its obscure and extreme-sounding inventory, soon made it a hub for most of the black metal activity in Norway and the surrounding countries. Many of these bands had formed entirely isolated from each other within the last year or so, and Helvete was the first and only place where they could meet to exchange music and ideas. Euronymous, together with Varg Vikernes, the sole member of the foundational black metal project Burzum, and in many ways the center of this story, and their small circle of fellow musicians who hung around the record shop comprised the core of the second wave. To many, this is considered the start of true black metal, and not just because of the change in sound, but because unlike their first wave predecessors, these artists did not just sing about being at war with Christianity, they were preparing for it. Christianity plays a large role in Norway. which provided the burgeoning black metal scene with a veritable buffet of blasphemous energy to pull from. The country's official religion is Protestantism, and while the role of the church in everyday life has been steadily decreasing, evangelism remains prevalent and sizable pockets of extreme conservatism still exist. Lords of Chaos, the definitive account of the Norwegian black metal scene, cites a particularly telling anecdote in which an episode of a children's TV series was pulled off the air because it featured a gun. And despite its grim and monstrous folkloric past, as of the early 90s, the country had only produced 2 horror movies in its otherwise illustrious filmic history. Norway also experienced a widespread satanic panic, both similar to and partially the result of the one that occurred in the US. It sprouted up only a few years before Helvet opened its doors. This is all to say that while Venom and others may have thought that it was obvious that their Satanist gimmicks were just that, the young Norwegians likely saw Satan, or at least some earthly manifestation of evil, as a real and even attainable presence in their lives. It is important to mention that while satanic imagery is frequently used in the lyrics and visual components of many early Norwegian black metal bands, their connection to the biblical Satan was more often symbolic of a general opposition to Christianity and a relationship with the dark side. Virtually no black metalers from this period identified with more mainstream occult movements like Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, which they saw as too positive and uplifting. When pressed about their religious affiliations, many of these artists expressed an interest in Norway's early pagan past. Vikirnes, and through him many others, identify as Odinists, their take on a contemporary religion largely established by the Austrian occultist Guido von List in the early 20th century, based on his own deeply racist readings of Old Norse texts and the fundamentally racist German nationalist folkish movement. The belief that Christianity deserves to be destroyed for its central role in the elimination of their presumed heathen ancestors was a primary motivation behind black metal's violent awakening. And by combining Odinism, classical satanic imagery, and rock and roll theatrics, the black metalers of Scandinavia successfully developed what I consider to be a functional religion, providing a mythology, moral code, and set of ritual practices for adherents. The awakening of evil in Norway began on April 8, 1991, when the vocalist of Mayhem, Per Dead Olin, lived up to his name and shot himself in the common space of the house he shared with his bandmates. A fan of self-mutilation on stage, Dead was known as a very introverted, depressed person by his scene mates. Friends seems a little intimate. So it was apparently no huge surprise when his band came home and found Dead alongside a note that read, "Sorry for all the blood." In fact, they were so unfazed that they quickly took some photos, later to be used as an album cover, and some unseemly souvenirs before calling the police. This was the first transgressive act that sparked the wave of violence and destruction to come. The black metal scene saw this as an instance of Dead proving his dedication to the darkness, and they wanted to go further. On June 6, 1992, the Fantoft Stave Church, first built in 1150, was burnt to the ground. Over the next 3 years, somewhere between 45 and 60 arsons would follow in its wake. Roughly 1/3 of those arsons were found to be directly linked to the black metal scene. But up until this point, church burnings were relatively rare in Norway, so it is not outrageous to guess that a good number of the remaining 2/3 had at least some connection to each other. Vikirnes was charged in connection with the Fantoft fire and several others, and while he mostly maintains his innocence, he has provided some impressive insight into the message the fires may have been meant to send. In an interview published in Lords of Chaos, Varg takes a guess at the motive. It's a psychological picture, an almost dead fire, a symbol of our heathen consciousness. The point was to throw dry wood and branches on that, to light it up and reach toward the sky again, as a growing force. He is also careful to note that the date of the first fire coincided with the anniversary of the first Viking raid in history, in the year 793 in Lindisfarne, England, with Vikings from Vikirnes' home county of Hordaland, Norway. A picture of the burnt church would appear as the cover of Burzum's second EP, Ask, Norwegian for Ashes. And this framing of one's heathen ancestors as smoldering ashes waiting to catch fire and topple Christianity explains much of the emotional force behind these crimes. As Varg frequently says, show Odin to the people and Odin will be lit in their souls. In the summer of 1993, Vikirnes took his pursuit of evil to its logical conclusion and murdered Euronymous in his home. frequently reported as the result of a rivalry between the two scene leaders, Varg insists that it was necessary for him to stab his ex-bandmate and fellow metal trailblazer 23 times across the body because Euronymous was planning to kill him first. This story, though, is mostly doubted by other members of the scene. Vikernes was arrested a few days later and charged with several counts of arson and possession of explosives, as well as murder, and was sentenced to 21 years in prison, which is the maximum sentence in Norway. But putting him away did not squash the spiritual fire that he had helped to spark. For his part, Varg continued to hone his devotion to Odin and wrote out and distributed a massive work regarding his religious, political, and lifestyle beliefs. This is not surprising, as Vikernes very clearly had religious intentions from Burzum's inception. Currently, he runs a website where he has posted hundreds of self-written articles about his past, his music, and his Odinist and pagan spirituality. In a series about the history of his musical contributions to the scene, he explains that he saw the project as an attempt to recreate an imagined past. One based in fantasy, Varg was a large Tolkien fan, but also rooted in his interpretation of his own pagan ancestry. Burzum's albums were written to function as spells, intended to be listened to at night while one is falling asleep. Each track on the record is meant to guide the listener through a meditative journey. He considers these musical rituals to be a powerful tool in this heathen awakening. And it seems, at least on a small scale, that Vikernes has succeeded in his goal. While the majority of the criminal activity was put to an end in the 2 years following his arrest, Varg and the other artists of the early 90s had essentially created their own genre, and with it, an elaborate subculture, which soon spread far outside of Scandinavia. Many groups have taken the spiritual potential of black metal and run with it, engaging in shamanistic acts of self-mutilation and performing elaborate rituals on stage. Bands like Watain and Gorgoroth have even engaged in animal sacrifice on stage. Today, there are entire festivals dedicated to ritual black metal, who state clearly in their press releases that they are not intended for fun, but rather they are solely there to help raise the spirit of black metal. Odinist-inspired black metal brotherhoods, such as the Wolves of Vinland, pictured here, have appeared where members attempt to incorporate this imagined Viking past into their everyday lives, often performing very involved rituals and sometimes even living on their own tribal land. Black metal was formed out of the desire to take satanic rock and roll antics and make them real. It rewards fans who take the genre's evil impulses to heart, providing lifestyle and spiritual guidelines for truly living black metal. And while there has not been another outburst of crime from the community, there was a church arson that happened over the summer that happened around the anniversary of Euronymous' murder, so it seems to be, at least in part, a nod to this moment. The black metal spirit has definitely not lessened. It's merely biding its time, waiting for war.